Attention, attention, this is History Lost in Time. And welcome to episode 42 of the History Lost in Time podcast. This podcast is published in German and English on YouTube, Spotify and Podcast.de. Social media presences exist on Blue Sky and Instagram. In this episode I will talk about the radio broadcasting history in the GDR, Communist East Germany. We will start with the uprising on June 17, 1953, and how it affected radio broadcasting. The topic of this episode. This episode is the logical continuation of episode 38, which stopped just before June 17, 1953. Political agenda and background. None. The sources that were used. Adelheid von Saldern, Inge Marsolek, Zuhören und gehört werden 2, Radio in der DDR der 50er Jahre, zwischen Lenkung und Ablenkung. Translation: Listen and being listened to 2, Radio in the GDR during the 1950s, from controlling to distracting. Published by Verlag Edition Discord, Tübingen, 1998. Bonner Berichte aus Mittel- und Ostdeutschland, der Rundfunk in der sowjetischen Besatzungszone Deutschlands. Translation: Bonn reports from Central and East Germany, radio broadcasting in the Soviet occupation zone, published by Dr. Gerhard Walter and the Federal Ministry of All German Questions, Federal German Publishing Agency, Bonn-Berlin, 1961. Heide Riedel, Hörfunk und Fernsehen in der DDR, ein Projekt des Deutschen Rundfunkmuseums. Translation: Radio and Television Broadcasting in the GDR, a project of the German Broadcasting Museum, published by Literarischer Verlag Helmut Braun, Köln, 1977. A major turning point in the early history of the GDR, and thus also in GDR broadcasting, was the uprising of June 17, 1953. Because of the intensified implementation of socialism, which focused mostly on the coal and steel industry, and the increased spending for the barrack people's police, there was a lack of everything for the common people. The consumer goods industry was unable to cope with demand, and food production was also lower than it should have been. The living standard in the West was significantly better, and the people in the East were no longer willing to accept this. Many people fled from the GDR. The final trigger for the uprising was an increase in work output standards. That meant that workers now had to work 10% more for the same wage. It was basically an increase in work time or a decrease in payment. Between June 12 and 17, 1953, there were protests all over the GDR. Initially, the protests targeted this increase in work output standards. However, due to the widespread discontent, the protests widened and became political. On June 17, 1953, the uprising was violently quelled by Soviet soldiers and the GDR People's Police. This included the use of tanks. The amount of casualties and arrested people varies depending on the source. However, it is generally agreed today that there were most likely 55 deaths and 15,000 arrested people. For the SED leadership, the uprising was a catastrophe. The workers, their core constituents, had turned against them. The SED therefore reacted in 2 ways. On the one hand, the historical record was heavily distorted. The media claimed that the uprising was triggered by Western saboteurs and troublemakers. There was even talk of a fascist coup attempt. On the other hand, the SED leadership was of course aware that it was nowhere near as firmly in the saddle as it had assumed. Therefore, a whole range of measures were implemented to raise the living standards of the GDR population and to respond to the demands and wishes of the population. Things that the SED had previously criminally neglected or completely ignored. The promotion of socialism was scaled back, and there was some self-criticism and course correction. The GDR media admitted that many things had been whitewashed and negative aspects had been omitted. However, the government was exempt from criticism. The editors of the respective media were blamed for this whitewashing. What did this mean for broadcasting? Broadcasting as a whole was reprimanded and criticized quite harshly. In addition to the general whitewashing that all media outlets were accused of, broadcasting also had to endure accusations that it was boring and cumbersome. This was objectively true, but broadcasting staff had to follow instructions from above. The result was programming changes that were ultimately positive. The proportion of word programs was reduced, and there was finally the much desired space for more music and entertainment programs. Indeed, there were finally decent entertainment program formats. One major entertainment program was Da lacht der Bär, translation The Bear Laughs. It was well received by the audience and only included a minimum of socialist educational content. GDR radio also began to copy broadcast formats from the West. Several quiz shows were created in both the West and the East at that time, modeled on programs from the USA. In the GDR, however, the effort was made to establish a connection to the riddle games of antiquity, so that the American connection would not be obvious. On GDR radio, the questions focused on socialist content. The book of the Ministry for All German Affairs lists examples of questions on page 161. How many television sets are there in Moscow? Where is the largest pioneer palace in the GDR? By returning which base did the Soviet Union recently serve the cause of peace? How many soldiers did the Soviet Union recently demobilize to ease the situation? How old did Michurin get in April? When is the next SED party conference? But the prizes you could win were substantial: scooters, refrigerators, radios, TVs, cameras, etc. A successful music show had the mathematical name 5 times 20 equals 100. The name arose from the fact that the show consisted of 5 20-minute segments, each featuring a different musical genre, so that each show could cater to 5 different musical tastes. Another show, called Unsere Wundertüte, translation roughly Our Wonderful Bag, primarily aired older songs from the 1920s and 30s. 5 times 20 equals 100 featured some political commentary in clips, while Wundertüte featured fewer. Men in particular were pleased by the increasing number of sports programs. Letters from listeners indicate that even then, sports topics were discussed with great passion and commitment. On page 75 of the book from the Ministry for All German Affairs, it states, "Music and entertainment programs were significantly expanded, and the closed evening block, popular in Germany, was introduced for all programs. Each week now featured a closed opera and an operetta evening, hit song lotteries and puzzle programs, request concerts, and the Aufbaulotterie, translation Reconstruction Lottery, radio plays and symphony concerts. The morning music consisting of Aufbaulieder, translation Reconstruction songs, activist marches and songs from the Communist Youth Organization FDJ was discontinued." The news was also shortened. Several regional programs, which had been eliminated with the centralization of 1952, were also reinstated. However, the political programs remained unchanged. Request concerts had been reintroduced in 1951. This format was taken from Nazi radio. To make them socialist, the request concerts were interspersed with ideological interjections. They were now called solidarity concerts and peppered with interviews, reports, appeals, self-commitments, etc. However, the interjections were mostly monotonous and boring. Moreover, listeners rejected these interruptions of the music program. The music selection itself was also viewed critically. Around 80% of the songs were workers' and militant songs, 20% opera melodies. Light entertainment music was virtually non-existent. But there were simply few or no socialist songwriters who were compatible with radio and who were liked by the people. Modern Western music, which had become popular in the West in the 1950s, was basically excluded. Criticism from listeners had little impact. The book by the Ministry for All German Affairs also includes a section on this. American hot music was finally banned from the program in the fall of 1950. Protests abounded, and in response to a listener's question, why should we always listen to West German stations to get good dance music, the program guide Der Rundfunk replied, "This friend is mistaken. We don't want to make jazz music at all. We don't want to imitate music at all. We want to make German music." After the ban on modern dance rhythms, chaos reigned in dance music programs. Music programs had to be created without knowing exactly what constituted American and what constituted German dance music. Light music from the Eastern Bloc countries was hard to come by. Film music and the reinterpretation of jazz music as popular art were used as a stopgap measure. Concessions were unavoidable in the medium term, and so jazz and Western music continued to be broadcast to a limited extent, but mostly late in the evening. It took a very long time for a kind of socialist pop music scene to develop. Until then, the West German RIAS program Schlager der Woche, translation Hit of the Week, was the music program that young people in the GDR listened to. Overall, after 1953, GDR radio broadcasts comprised approximately 60% of music programs, 20% of spoken word programs, and 20% of mixed programs. Furthermore, criticism of poor reception was finally addressed and the technical infrastructure was improved. By the mid-1950s, one could speak of full broadcasting coverage in the GDR. There were 5 million registered devices and a device density of 77.1 devices per 100 households. There was no longer any difference between urban and rural areas. New radio sets were mass-produced, and in order to visually distinguish them from Nazi radio sets, horizontal long-format devices were now manufactured. The Nazi Volksempfänger, in contrast, had been a vertical upright device. Frequency usage was also expanded. In 1945, only 4 medium-wave frequencies were in use. Since neither East nor West adhered to the Copenhagen wave plan, frequencies were simply annexed and used multiple times. By 1950, GDR broadcasting was already using 7 medium-wave frequencies, 1 long-wave and 3 short-wave frequencies. By 1955, there were already 15 frequencies on medium-wave, 1 on long-wave, 3 on short-wave, and 9 FM frequencies in use. Between 1952 to 55, the GDR's radio stations were renamed several times. As already mentioned, before 1952, there were the Berlin station and the Germany station. In 1952, there were Berlin 1, 2, and 3. At the end of 1953, the name Germany station reappeared. Berlin 2 and 3 were then renamed Berlin First Program and Berlin Second Program in 1954. And in 1955, the final names were finally established. Now there were Germany radio station, Berlin radio station, and Radio GDR. The mission of the Germany radio station always remained the same: a combat program aimed at the West. The Berlin radio station increasingly became a local station for the greater Berlin area, while Radio GDR ultimately became the lead radio station for the entire GDR. The new approach included more self-criticism and a focus on the concrete needs of the population. There were programs such as Wir schalten uns ein, translation We Get Involved, in which the radio addressed listeners' general complaints and attempted to help. These were general topics such as pension concerns, material procurement problems, administrative issues, etc. The tone, however, was very serious, harsh, and humorless, as was generally the case with all topics. GDR radio's public relations work included on-site visits to businesses or villages. Some of these visits caused the functionaries to be confronted with harsh, very unpleasant criticism, as described in the Listening and Being Heard book on pages 292 and 293. June 17, 1953 happened because many of us were dissatisfied, records the briefing report on this listeners' meeting. It clearly speaks of women's continued distrust of the promises made by the party and the Soviet Union, as long as hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war had not yet returned from the Soviet Union and everything along the demarcation line was surrounded by barbed wire. Ultimately, it was West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer who brought the last prisoners of war home in 1955. The Soviet Union wanted to establish diplomatic relations with West Germany, and during his visit to Moscow, Adenauer made it clear that this would only happen if the prisoners of war returned to Germany. The Soviets evasively argued that there were no more prisoners of war in the Soviet Union, only convicted war criminals. Ultimately, however, the Soviet Union released both the prisoners of war and the civilian internees. It is suspected, or even confirmed, I don't know for sure, that the Soviets had factored this in from the beginning. Working for the East German broadcasting wasn't exactly easy for its employees. With the end of Soviet censorship at the end of 1949 and the takeover by the East German authorities, freedom of expression was increasingly curtailed and control expanded. A system of mutual spying and denunciation created a climate of mistrust within this broadcasting system, and the spying extended far into private life. This began during training and continued into professional life. The system of criticism and self-criticism was particularly brutal. One or more individuals were exposed in front of the assembled team, harshly criticized and forced to engage in self-criticism. The Listening and Being Heard book cites an example from the GDR Broadcasting School on page 67. Sanctions were decided upon in regular teacher meetings. Students were involved in this process in that they were asked to submit statements and confront the affected classmates at meetings. At these meetings or in letters, measures against the individuals in question were then proposed. This creates the impression that it was the students alone who reprimanded their classmates for the good of the collective. Teachers, the party leadership, and the youth organization FDJ were behind these decisions and were ultimately the authorities that decided on and implemented these sanctions. The same principle was also applied in other institutions and companies in the GDR. And the control went even further, quote on pages 130 and 131. To monitor adherence to socialist virtues, the editorial directors were instructed to keep a record of each employee. Editorial directors were viewed negatively if they were only interested in the work of their employees, and they were encouraged to also observe and assess the private lives of each individual in the future. The interference in private life went so far that friendships, even intimate ones, were criticized and prevented. Marriages were also sometimes forced or prevented. Anything that seemed to disrupt or undermine the work of the party in any way was to be suppressed. And this control was very detailed. The book of the Ministry for All German Affairs states on page 37, with the total planning of broadcasting activities, total control also began. Every department head was required to submit daily reports to the directorate on their performance and experiences. This daily report was replaced on January 1st, 1952 by a detailed monthly report from the directorate. However, the departments were required to report to the directorate weekly and monthly. The system of mutual spying was institutionalized by the Ministry for State Security, or Stasi for short. As stated on page 132 in the book Listening and Being Heard, the fact that dictatorships depend on denunciations from the population became particularly clear during the Nazi era. The situation in the GDR was different. There they did not rely on spontaneous denunciations, but rather institutionalized denunciation comprehensively by establishing a large apparatus of unofficial collaborators, who were often blackmailed into their spying activities, which in turn allows conclusions to be drawn about the degree to which the GDR system was firmly anchored among the population. Through a denunciation, it was easy to harm an unpopular colleague. Thus, those affected had to justify themselves to the entire editorial staff or the company party meeting and engage in self-criticism. An unacceptable private life could result in transfers to other departments or warnings. Defending against these methods was almost impossible. One either adapted or fled to the West. The atmosphere in the broadcasting buildings was correspondingly negative, as the book of the Ministry for All German Affairs states on page 45. The daily increasing nervousness at the Masurenallee Broadcasting Center also contributed to the disappointing development of the programs broadcast by the Berlin station and the Germany station. Unqualified personnel replaced experienced radio operators. The surveillance system and the need to meet targets put a strain on the working atmosphere. The political climate in the capital, Berlin, was tense. The Red Broadcasting Center on Masurenallee, as a communist enclave in the British sector, became a source of constant annoyance. The Soviets and the SED also used the broadcasting building for subversive activities in the western sector, all of which took place under the protection of Soviet soldiers. Protests from the West were ineffective. However, the Soviets and the SED realized that they would hardly be able to maintain this base in the long run, so they began building alternative broadcasting buildings in the East early on, as early as 1946-47. Quote page 47-48. The Communist Party's base activities at the Masurenallee Broadcasting House took on forms in 1950 that necessitated intervention by the West Berlin authorities. Innocent residents of East Germany, unaware of Berlin's situation, occasionally went to the broadcasting house on Masurenallee, believing they were visiting a West Berlin broadcasting station. The doormen exploited this misconception. The visitors were led under false pretenses to representatives of the State Security Service, who then transported them by car to the Soviet sector. As a result of these incidents, 4 Berlin broadcasting employees were arrested in early December 1950. Large signs bearing the addresses of RIAS and NWDR, 2 Western radio stations, were erected in front of the brick building. But this warning was not sufficient, and so the British military government authorized the erection of another sign reading, "This is not a West Berlin broadcasting station." In May 1952, the GDR Broadcasting moved to the Oberschöneweide Broadcasting Complex. On June 1, 1952, operations at Masurenallee ceased. As retaliation for the temporary occupation and isolation of the West Berlin enclave of Steinstücken by the Soviets and the GDR, the broadcasting house was sealed off and isolated by British troops on June 3, 1952. This isolation was maintained for a week. After the GDR Broadcasting ceased operations at the Masurenallee, an SED sabotage squad destroyed the facilities and predicted that reconstruction would take at least 18 months. The Soviet Union did not hand the building over to the West Berlin Senate until July 1956. As early as December 4, 1957, before the expiration of the 18-month period, the West Berlin radio station Sender Freies Berlin, translation Free Berlin Broadcasting Company, was able to begin operations from there. However, working in broadcasting was difficult for employees even at the new location in the GDR. Constant ID checks, daily instructions for the editorial staff from the very top, spontaneous searches, criticism and self-criticism, and mutual spying remained a daily occurrence. Another internal factor was the company party organization BPO. It represented the SED in the workplace, established a system of mutual surveillance, and provided political training for employees. The BPO initially had a rather weak presence, but from 1948 onwards it was able to act much more vigorously. From June 1950 onwards, all employees of the Berlin station were required to attend 2 political instruction sessions per week. The BPO also independently conducted criticism and self-criticism among employees. One factor that hampered all work in the editorial offices of the GDR media was the requirement to work on so-called priority topics. Every year, there were new topics that were to be prominently presented in the media. This naturally limited the flexibility of the media staff. Topics that were particularly in focus in 1951 included, for example, friendship with the Soviet Union, the Five-Year Plan, and the work of the GDR government. If there were current topics that absolutely had to be covered, the media staff were forced to wait for argumentation guidelines from the SED leadership. This was where the narrative for each news story was determined. Only once these guidelines were in place could news be reported. This inevitably ensured that news was reported more quickly in the West than in the East. Heide Riedel describes the system on page 29. The mass media forms a self-contained apparatus that serves the exercise of power by the ruling party, the SED. To keep this apparatus functioning continuously, a dual strategy was developed. A. Short-term, through daily argumentative instructions. B. Long-term, through quarterly global guidelines, which are differentiated into weekly schedules. Topic focuses were also found in group-specific programs, for example on youth radio. In the early 1950s, there was extensive reporting on the economic five-year plan, the youth brigades, and the militarization of the GDR via the Barrack People's Police and the resulting National People's Army, NVA. The youth consecration ceremony, SED party conferences, and the confrontation with the West also occupied considerable space. An episode from children's radio demonstrates the way in which political content worked its way into every aspect of broadcasting. Until the summer of 1950, children's radio was headed by Dr. Ilse Obrig. She had already worked in children's radio at the MDR in the Weimar Republic in 1928 and continued this work for the Greater German Broadcasting. Her children's radio was apolitical and could therefore function in all three systems: democracy, communism, and National Socialism. During her summer vacation in 1950, however, her program was replaced by FDJ broadcasts. Insulted, she left the Berlin station and moved with her entire team to Rias in West Berlin, where she was able to continue her apolitical children's radio program. The GDR Broadcasting took advantage of Dr. Obrig's departure to introduce politics in children's radio as well. In the West, Dr. Obrig worked for children's radio and was also able to help shape children's television programming during the 1950s and 60s. The Sandman on television can be traced back to her, in both the East and West incidentally, as GDR television had learned of Obrig's plans and quickly developed its own Sandman, which then aired shortly before the West German Sandman. Dr. Ilse Obrig received the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1973. At the end of this episode, there are three more small topics to discuss. First, foreign connections. Was there any broadcasting cooperation between the socialist countries? Initially, indeed not. Only the Soviet Union maintained working contacts with East German broadcasting. It wasn't until the early 1950s that contacts were established with the rest of the communist bloc, first with Hungary and later with other socialist states. Further contacts with non-aligned countries were established in the late 1950s, including Egypt, Indonesia, Yugoslavia, and Iraq. Second, what about the development of the broadcasting magazine Der Rundfunk, and why was it so important? The broadcasting magazine Der Rundfunk was as important at the time as the television magazine was in the pre-internet era. Without it, you didn't really know what was on and when, and therefore you couldn't prepare in advance. You could only listen at random. This made GDR citizens all the more annoyed when programming changes occurred. From 1946 to 48, the magazine also printed the Rias program, but then removed it without explanation. West German stations such as NWDR and Südwestfunk were listed in a limited capacity until 1952, but then they too were removed. Foreign stations that were listed were essentially only Eastern Bloc stations and a few neutral stations such as those from Austria, Sweden and Yugoslavia. Overall, however, the paper was quite sterile and boring until 1952. After the formation of the State Broadcasting Committee, its quality improved and it developed into a proper magazine. And third, what about television? There had already been experimental television programs in the Weimar Republic. During the Third Reich, regular television programming had been broadcast in the Greater Berlin area for years. However, these programs were watched primarily in mini-cinemas rather than on television sets at home. It wasn't until December 1952 that the GDR was able to launch its own experimental television programs. The centerpiece of these programs was the news program Aktuelle Kamera. In both the West and the East, it was an advantage for early television producers that there were few historical comparisons for Germans. Few Germans had watched Nazi television, and if they had, it was rare, since it had to be planned outside the home like a trip to the movies. This made it possible to set new individual standards. Heide Riedel writes on page 58, "From the very beginning of its development, GDR television has had an open and blatant partisan function, which fundamentally distinguishes it from the theoretical conception of Western television systems and also from the GDR radio programs of its early phase." GDR television began regular operations in January 1956. At that time, half the population was theoretically capable of receiving television. During the experimental phase until the end of 1955, 2 hours of programming were broadcast daily. By 1957, this had already increased to 4 hours, and by 1961 to 8 hours. A few finishing words. What should stick in your mind after this episode? 1. June 17, 1953 was a massive turning point for the GDR, reflected in all aspects of life. The forced development of socialism with its focus on heavy industry, in essence the Stalin program of the 1920s and 30s, was not suited to Germany in the 1950s. For better or for worse, the SED leadership had to choose its own adapted course. 2. Living and working in the GDR took place under constant surveillance and spying. There was hardly any private space to retreat to. The compulsion to constantly work collectively and also to act collectively in private life created a climate of distrust. The next radio episode will focus on GDR broadcasting in the late 1950s. Thank you. This was History Lost in Time.